still moving in Zoom manner from waiting room to full attendance. So I will talk slowly for a few moments and introduce myself. Welcome back to this wonderful conference on the future of EU-UK relations. My name is Bill Emmott. I have the fortune to be British and the second fortune to be living in Dublin as a Brexile, an exile from Brexit. I've been living here in Dublin for 2 years. I am delighted to be asked by Federico Fabbrini to chair this session on prospects, the prospects that our speakers see before them in this EU-UK relationship. And we have 3 excellent speakers. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First will be Nicolas Levrat from the University of Geneva, Director of the Global Studies Institute, Professor in Law at the University of Geneva. His paper is entitled Governance, Managing Bilateral Relations. And I will just quote from the end of the paper. He says, 1 month into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, quotes, prospects are not very bright for a proper governance scheme for the bilateral relations to emerge. So perhaps I've already stolen his thunder, since that's clearly a summary of his view. Second, I will have Bridget Laffan, political scientist, of course, Irish and happens to be currently in Dublin, she tells us, but most of the time is in Florence, in Fiesole at the European University Institute as director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. Her paper is on sovereignty and Brexit from theory to practice. And she ends her paper by saying, quotes, the UK may find that it has traded formal sovereignty for effective control. So we will hear more about that issue from Bridget. And last but not least, your own Federico Fabbrini, Professor of European Law at Dublin City University, talking to us from Bolzano. We are all envious of his being in sunny Bolzano right now. Principal of the Brexit Institute, educated in Trento, Bologna, and himself at the European University Institute, and author of the recent book that you all know about, Brexit and the Future of the European Union, The Case for Constitutional Reforms. Each of our speakers will talk for a maximum of 15 minutes, followed by discussion and questions. You can submit your questions by raising your hand, by turning on your video and raising your hand, or hitting the raise hand function, or by sending written questions if you prefer in the chat function. You're very welcome to speak your questions yourself, in which case the administrators will turn your microphone on and I will invite you to speak. But first of all, let me ask Nicolas Levrat to open our proceedings. Over to you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much. And first, thank you to Federico and all his team at the Brexit Institute for organizing such interesting event. And well, actually, I have doubt about my competences to discuss about how to manage the way out of the EU, because as you probably know, Switzerland never went in. So we probably don't know how to get out. But it seems when I observe what's happening that actually nobody really knows how to get out properly. So what I will try to address in this 15 minutes is to figure out whether we find building blocks of a governance scheme for managing the future UK-EU bilateral relation. And before dealing with this substantive part of the issue, I would like to emphasize 2 points that you find in the title. First, bilateral relations is a new approach for the EU with its neighborhood, at least for the past 30 years. For those who have been following these, let's say, European policy of the EU, you may remember that following the events of 1989, the EFTA country all ran to the EC still at that time, asking for a renewed bilateral relationship. And very quickly, the member states and the Commission told them, no way, We're not going to negotiate bilaterally with everyone. It's this EFTA bloc and the EU, not yet the EU, and we will negotiate together a genuine broad framework for our relation. And it turned out to be the European Economic Area, even though now you only have 3 non-EU states within it. But the idea was to have it as a bloc. Same thing happened with enlargement. If you remember in '93, despite the fact that the Commission and the member states say each case will be taken individually, it's a global process. And it leads to 2004, 10 states entering at once and so on. So, and even after, when there was enlargement fatigue, then was set up the neighborhood policy that we find now in Article 8 of the treaty. And this is always this idea that EU will not negotiate bilateral relations, but is trying to have a general scheme to manage its relationship with neighbor. So I want to emphasize that this type of bilateral relation is something rather new. Sure, there was Switzerland, but Switzerland was an exception and was conceived as such. Now maybe things are changing. Maybe the European Commission and the EU are willing to have genuine bilateral relationship. And on the other side, we should also notice that for the UK, managing such relationship is also something quite new. And yesterday there were debate about the weak content of this trade and cooperation agreement. And some were wondering how and why the UK did not negotiate better. But maybe part of the answer is just that because they lost the habit. They delegated this task of negotiating trade agreement to the EU, the European Commission, since 1972. So it's another area, and this is why we have to look at what is possible, what is not possible. The second element I want to emphasize is this governance approach. Governance has, I would say, 2 broadly different schemes. Within the EU, for those who have been studying that, you know that since 1992, Gary Marks came up with this idea of multi-level governance, which was picked up by the Commission in its white paper on European governance in 2001. We have all these, let's say, elaborate scheme of governance, which are playing with the institution, member states, different level, different function, and so on. This is not the governance we'll be talking about. If you remember, also in 1992, James Rosnow and other authors had this book, which was called Governing Without Government. And so how do you produce desired outcome without having a properly organized institutional scheme? And this is much more in this second dimension of governance that will be moving in the next minutes. So actually, it's not for lack of institutions that we need to be in a governing without government scheme. Because if you read the 29 December Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU, what will strike you is a wide discrepancy between the very elaborate institutional scheme and the very thin content, very light content, legal commitment on both parts. There's actually an imbalance. And the question is whether this institutional scheme has been built to manage the existing relation, or whether it is rather conceived, and I think this is the second option we will have to take seriously, it's rather conceived as the platform for negotiating the content of future relationship. However, I shall argue that maybe this platform is not ideal. It may not help to produce such easy outcome. And Bill, don't worry, I've changed my conclusion, because now it's not 1 month into the implementation when I wrote the paper, now it's 2 months, and it looks even worse, I'm sorry. So we'll see why, maybe. So basically, there is this idea, you find that at the beginning in the article, well, it's hard to give the name of article because you have name and number and so on, but Comprov 2 say that basically, if the parties conclude additional agreements, they should fit in the structure. They should become parts of this overall structure. And I think this is quite strange, because somehow you have the feeling that the parties have negotiated this huge institutional structure, which is very impressive. I mean, actually, we have no less than 8 specialized committees, plus the trade committee, which itself is supervising 10 trade specialized committee. We have working groups, we have an overall partnership committee. So we have a huge institutional building, and then most of the rooms of the building are empty. They need to be filled up. And if I can allow a metaphor with, let's say, real estate market, all those who are in that business know that if you build a huge office building and you do not find people, business, to fill in the offices, well, then the whole project is really not secure. It may collapse. And so, yes, I think we need to fill the rooms, but how? That's a difficult question. Actually, interestingly, we have this overarching partnership council, and below we have a very decentralized mechanism. And for example, interestingly, as regards the monitoring of the agreement, the process is very decentralized. It will be for each specialized committee, and in trade, each sub-trade specialized committee, to try to monitor the implementation, eventually to smooth relation, avoid dispute, and so on. But there's always a possibility to go up to the partnership agreement. And yesterday there was a discussion, and I think that's an important issue and an important point, whether these future negotiations to develop the legal framework of the EU-UK relationship will be mostly political negotiation at the highest level, more or less like we've seen with the negotiation of this agreement, or whether it will be a very decentralized process, quite technical, which actually looks much more like what the Commission likes to do. Somehow this technocratic way of dealing with issues, rather than to have big political bargaining, which leads to confrontation and suddenly this famous miracle moment where agreement is there. So here there are two very different paths, and I'm not sure that both sides, meaning the EU and the UK, are on the same, let's say, perspective on which path to use. Second, this huge institutional setting seems to be interesting to produce desired outcome, meaning some sort of decision. And by the way, Article 4 says that the decision adopted by the Partnership Council or by a committee shall be binding on the party and all the bodies set up under this agreement. So we have some sort which could give some strength to decision, but every single decision at any level has to be taken by mutual consent. So if you don't have strong convergence of view at any level, it will be extremely difficult to have these institutions set up by the TCA to produce anything. Further, it is interesting to notice that when the Council authorized the ratification and provisional application of the TCA, it made rather clear choices about how the Commission will have the capacity to maneuver in this negotiation. And if you read this decision of 29 December, you will see that by approving the functioning of the TCA, even in provisional application, the Council decided, I quote, each member state should be allowed to send one representative to accompany the Commission representative as part of the Union delegation in meetings of the Partnership Council and of other joint bodies established under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So the member states will be there all the time for all these trade negotiations. That's not, I mean, I know under the common foreign I'm sorry, the word in English are not exactly the same than in French, the commercial competence. The Commission negotiates, the states do have a committee that can supervise what the Commission is negotiating, but they're not as present as this decision really asks for. And basically, in the decision, the member states clearly say that actually the procedure of Article 218 will be used within the instruction that will be given for the Commission to negotiate and to reach agreements. So basically, from the side of the member state of the EU, these potential governance scheme, this institutional framework, is not for managing existing legal relations, but it's mostly, if not exclusively, to develop new agreements that will come and eventually give flesh to the bones of this trade and cooperation agreement. So if you combine the fact, and all those who know about trade negotiation know that it's tough negotiation. And if member states are at the table, they will defend specific interests. So it will be hard to reach agreement. Further, you imagine that it is subdivided in many different fora, meaning most likely that it will not be the same people from the Commission in each of these specialized committees, and the same for member states. They will come from different ministries. So the capacity of this institutional scheme to produce new regulation is not a certainty. And somehow it seems that the institutional scheme was really devised to manage an existing legal framework and not to develop a new framework. But due to time constraints, it was not possible to reach a far-reaching agreement on substance with this TCA. And so we're left with an imbalance between the institutional framework and the content. So yes, 2 months into the provisional implementation of the TCA, the prospects are not very bright, as you were saying. We've already seen major wars and tension burst between the parties at a level that is even beyond the functioning of the TCA. And let us not forget about possible interference with other legal regimes. Interestingly, there is an article in 11 which guarantee exclusivity of the mechanism of the agreement. But Article 12, just after that, say, oh, choice of forum in case of substantially equivalent obligation under another international agreement. And there is an express reference to WTO, which makes sense for trade issues. And by the way, the dispute settlement mechanism, which is provided for in the TCA, is not very far from the system of WTO, but there are many other forums. I'm sure people in Ireland remember that in 2001, when the UK wanted to build and exploit a MOX plant at Sellafield, they tried to block them, and they seized an arbitral tribunal based on a convention on the natural milieu of the North Ocean Atlantic. And the Commission went against Ireland, and in 2006, there was a decision by the European Court of Justice saying Ireland cannot settle such an issue under a compulsory international agreement, but which is not EU law because of EU provision and so on. So there was some consistency in the system, but now in the, there is the risk that cases may go in other fora. We know that the dispute about sovereignty over Rockall has emerged again. Where will that be settled? It's certainly not under TCA, even though it has a huge impact on that, among other things, fisheries issue. Will it go to the International Court of Justice? What about the withdrawal agreement? We know that the Court of Justice is given competences even for the next 8 years. It can even get preliminary ruling on the implementation. So we don't have a coherent regime. Don't worry, I'm finishing in 1 minute. So I think the issue is to see how it will be possible for this institutional framework to define the role of law. And somehow the UK moved from a governance scheme which was based on the rule of law, and now there are interrogation of the role of law in this governance scheme. And further, I think that the UK has moved out of a system which was based on mutual trust. We all know the case law of the ECG on this mutual trust, to, unfortunately, an open sea horizon where mutual distrust seems to be the founding principle for a minima governance scheme. So yes, very unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about the current capacity of both parties to manage their bilateral relation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was admirably clear. As you say, you fulfilled the expectation that the prospects were not very bright. I very much enjoyed, especially this contradiction in a way between the decentralization setup of the governance and actually a will to escalate disputes to a high level. I always thought that the right principle, the three-word slogan should be "Make Brexit Boring," which might not be the desire of the Brexit Institute, but nevertheless would be to turn it technical, and we are not in that situation. Bridget Laffan, let me pass over to you in Dublin / Fiesole for making Brexit unboring.
Thank you very much, and good morning, and thank you, Federico, for including me in this project. It's a great project, and certainly for social scientists, Brexit won't be boring and isn't boring. So let me share my screen, if I may. So let me begin by on the program, I was to write a chapter on alignment and divergence. But in fact, as I thought about it, I thought that really, given that we're now at the end of this phase of Brexit, the end of the beginning, there is a withdrawal agreement and there is a future relationship, the CTA. It really is important, I think, to puzzle why we've ended up with the Brexit we've ended up with, that thin, very thin trade agreement, and also with the kind of governance structures that Nicolas has just described. And there, I think, we really have to look to the role of ideas, not just in framing politics, but also in framing outcome. In other words, sovereignty. And secondly, for me, there's a big social science puzzle, and that is why economic actors really did not manage to impinge greatly on the outcomes. In other words, why was it that ideas trumped material interest, which goes against all of the political economy literature on trade agreements, where you would expect to find the active producer groups working to make sure that their industries either got market access or were protected. So I think there's a very interesting social science puzzle here. So that's why I thought, well, I'll take a look at sovereignty. Now, I'm now trying to move on my, it doesn't seem to want to move on for me. Oh yeah, okay. So the argument in the chapter is basically that the UK was never comfortable with the practice of sovereignty as an EU member state, and that goes way back to preferences about international cooperation. I would argue certainly evident in the discussions on the establishment of the Council of Europe right through the 1960s and the 70s. In other words, sovereignty never went away. It was there all of the time in the way in which the British political elites approached international cooperation. Secondly, as we know, sovereignty discourse was very prominent in the referendum. Take back control is one of the great political slogans of the 21st century. It resonated, it had a political impact, and it was about control, sovereignty, something that had been lost and could now be regained. In other words, take back. And I won't, those two parts of the paper, I will not say any more about. But on the third and fourth, the UK red lines set out by Theresa May as early as October 16 were sovereignty driven. And then, as we know, the Johnson government opted for a sovereignty first Brexit. So in a way, sovereignty has explanatory power when it comes to understanding the kind of TCA and how we got here. And I'm not going to, obviously, sovereignty is a highly contested and complex concept. It's a multidimensional concept. So I'm not going to say much about it other than to say that sovereignty clearly within a state is constitutive of a political community, and it is that interface between law and politics. And because sovereignty is linked to territoriality, then sovereignty has to be understood as having both an internal dimension, what happens within states, and external dimension. Clearly, EU membership has varied but significant effects on the exercise of sovereignty, on legal sovereignty, direct effect and supremacy, and the fact that EU treaties are constitutional in nature alters the practice of legal sovereignty. Without doubt, it's very clear. Political sovereignty is different because the 27 EU member states do not regard themselves as any less sovereign than the United Kingdom. Rather, politically, they choose to practice a pooling and sharing of sovereignty. In other words, they are committed to putting their sovereignty into the collective, to be exercised collectively, but of course, only in those areas as permitted by the treaties. So political sovereignty is not an either or, whereas direct effect and obviously supremacy is different. And then popular sovereignty, as the EU has expanded its policy range, as it has become more like a political system, more like a polity in its own right, then popular sovereignty has been impacted, and there's a lot of tension between the exercise of popular sovereignty within the member states and then within the collective. But I think to understand where we've ended up with Brexit, we need to distinguish between sovereignty as a concept and an idea, and perhaps an aspiration, and sovereignty as a practice by states. And I would argue that Brexit is really about a clash of sovereignty practices. It's a clash of models of how to handle the international system in the 21st century. And I think one of the big challenges for the future is that I remain to be convinced that the United Kingdom actually accepts the legitimacy of the way in which the EU practices sovereignty. I think that there is a clash of models that's very deep and makes it very difficult for the next phase of the relationship. We need to get beyond, it's not just the boring bit, but we need to get beyond the situation where we have a government in the United Kingdom that almost has, because it's not concerned about sovereignty in other international fora, but the EU. So in other words, how do we get to a stage where there is mutual respect between these two parties in terms of a future relationship? And I don't think we're anywhere near yet. Then moving on to how we've ended up with the TCA we've ended up with. Well, I would argue that Theresa May, in a way, she, as a Remainer, albeit in my view a reluctant Remainer, she found herself in charge of a government where she gave significant voice to Brexiteers, but she also had to deliver Brexit. At no stage did Theresa May think that it was not a political imperative to deliver the exit of the UK from the EU from the beginning. But the way in which she framed it, both in her Conservative Party speech in October 16, and then later in later in the Lancaster House speech, it really was the language of red lines, a language of sovereignty. She talks of full independent sovereign country, no longer part of this other model of sovereignty, the collective model, political union, clearly no supranational institutions, and nothing that the EU could do should override parliaments and courts. Freedom to make our own decisions. In other words, internal sovereignty, taking back control of our laws, our borders, and our money. Now, for Theresa May, that was the upper end. That was what she was committed to doing. But because she was a reflective prime minister, and because she also understood the complexities involved, Theresa May began to row back from those very red lines and pinkify them. And she was trying to find a solution, in my view, to two problems. She was trying to find a solution to Northern Ireland, to the Union, to maintain the UK Union, and she was trying to limit the damage to the UK economy. And her way of doing that was the all-UK customs union and, of course, the famous Chequers deal, where she agreed that in certain areas, the UK, particularly goods, the UK would align with the EU, would buy into what they called the common rule book. That was a polite way of saying the EU rule book, because there was no common rule book that the EU would ever agree to. And that was not politically viable at home, and nor agreeable, and it says here, to the UK. In fact, that should be the EU. Now, I think there's an interesting question. There were voices in the EU that would have given Chequers at least a serious look as the beginning of a softer Brexit, not as an outcome, rather as the beginning. But the fact that she lost so many cabinet ministers immediately meant that they were simply, no one in the EU thought that she could deliver domestically. She was so weak that they didn't think that even if they made the kind of concessions that Chequers, and Chequers was a very big ask of the EU, any version of it, that it would make any difference domestically. So we had a situation under May where there at least was a recognition of the trade-off between sovereignty and the economy, and sovereignty and the integrity of the United Kingdom. That disappears completely with the arrival of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, and that's why we've ended up with the thin gruel TCA that we've ended up with. He wrote to Tusk in August 19 saying that the existing withdrawal agreement, the May agreement, was incompatible with UK sovereignty. It was incompatible with UK sovereignty because of Northern Ireland, because of the all UK customs union, and because he felt at that stage that that withdrawal agreement was tying the UK into too much alignment, which he said, and in the letter he says, divergence is the point of our exit. No point leaving the EU and the regulatory space of the EU if we don't get to diverge. So what did Johnson, given those very strong preferences on sovereignty, what did Johnson end up with? Well, he had to make the choice in the end between a sovereignty first Brexit for Great Britain rather than the entire UK. In other words, he had to agree to the border in the Irish Sea and all that that implied, given the Northern Ireland Protocol, all of those areas that are affected by, that stay within the UK or the EU regulatory space. And that was a choice that Theresa May had said no British Prime Minister would ever make. But Johnson made it, and he made it largely because it was the only way that he could get a sovereignty first GB Brexit, in my view, but obviously open to discussion. Now, we then come to the TCA. That's where we've ended up. And that is a thin, extremely thin agreement. And if you look at the relationships between third country European states and the EU, the UK is weaker than any other state other than Russia. It is much weaker than Turkey, much weaker than Switzerland, much weaker than Norway. In other words, it is, if we think of the Barnier Scalier, they've gone right down that Barnier Scalier. And that was because that's what they wanted. This is what Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and David Frost wanted. They signaled it in red lights. They changed the tone and they changed their negotiating objectives. And Johnson, before the negotiations began earlier 2020, said, we want to restore full sovereignty over our borders, immigration, competition, subsidy rules, procurement, and data protection. That's what we want. And then we have his man in Brussels, David Frost, who said the UK wanted to become an independent country like any other. And sovereignty was not meaningless. It was about your own rules to suit your own circumstances, internal sovereignty. And he actively, in his Brussels speech, embraced friction. He said, we're not frightened by it. There's going to be friction and there's going to be greater barriers. So the UK has walked into this agreement, the TCA, with its eyes open. It's what it wanted. Also, when we look at the TCA itself, so all of the contentious issues that went right up to the wire in terms of agreement all had a significant sovereignty dimension, and the UK position and preference was driven by sovereignty. Firstly, on governance, and Nicolas went through the complexities of the governance arrangements, but the UK did not want a unified governance regime. They didn't want a partnership council that would govern the entire regime because they thought they'd have they would get better outcomes if they could sectoralize and divide and fragment the relationship with the UK or with the EU. Level playing field, all about sovereignty, fisheries, again, control of our waters. Now, formally, in terms of the level playing field, they got sovereignty. In other words, each party is free to determine its future policies and priorities with respect to labour, social, environmental, climate protection, and subsidy control. In other words, the TCA says both parties are independent in regulatory terms. They can do what they want to do in those areas. So that's sovereignty on steroids. But of course, the devil is in the detail, because the EU would have wanted stronger level playing field provisions linked into European law, if at all possible. That they were not going to get. So then what they did was they stitched in a set of dispute resolution mechanisms, rebalancing mechanisms into the agreement. In other words, in the event of significant divergence, the EU can engage in unilateral rebalancing measures. Now, of course, both sides can, but since the UK didn't want these provisions, one has to see them as EU-driven provisions. In other words, the right unilaterally to retaliate. So the UK has got its theoretical sovereignty, but divergence does not come cost-free. Then in terms of the balance already between divergence and alignment, well, what we will see is a patchwork. What we already have is cut and paste, a lot of retained EU law. For example, in the environmental policy area, 500 pieces of European law are now domestic British law. In areas like copyright, climate change, on the emissions trading system, the UK has set up its own trading system, but it's modelled on the EU trading system, and those two trading systems are going to have to remain aligned. on GDPR, etc., gas and electricity. So in all those areas, then there is continuity and alignment. Now, there are tweaks,
forgive me,
and
Bridget,
the EU
ask you to come towards a conclusion. Just
well, okay. So then perhaps what I will move on to, the government in London is still searching for divergence and areas it can diverge. But let's say, what are the wins if you take a sovereignty lens? Number one, the TCA is international public law, not European law. The GB has the right to diverge from EU regulation. And I would say the single biggest area of divergence is migration. The UK does now control migration policy into the UK, and it has replaced free movement with its own regime. So all of this story is a trade-off between market access and divergence that is unresolved, probably unresolvable, because it's going to be a tension in this relationship all the way along. It's not going away. The UK has formally left the EU regulatory space in terms of its institutions and agencies, but not its orbit. And you see the dynamic in an area like fisheries, where you get control but not total control, and then you have the market access issues. And the EU, at least for now, is content that it has locked the UK in terms of the level playing field. So to end, sovereignty discourse, sovereignty, and the idea of sovereignty, in my view, explains a lot about where we ended up with Brexit. There are some gains for the UK, but really it's migration. And in terms of the tension between sovereignty and autonomy, it's been laid bare, and it has divided the United Kingdom between GB and Northern Ireland. And the UK still ends up as the weaker power in this relationship. So it can't, there is no ideal sovereignty for the UK. It has chosen to practice its sovereignty in a way that is very damaging to its economy. Can that hold? Will it hold? I think there's a big clash of models between the EU and the UK. And I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. That was very, very interesting. I think that point you raised right at the start about how, in this case, ideas have trumped material interests is a fascinating one. And a lot of the prospects will depend on the degree to which those material interests either are satisfiable in new ways by the UK, or, as the Brexiters would claim, or whether the material interests now regain control, as it were, take back their own control. But now I'm going to hand over to, we might come on to that in questions, I'm sure. I will now hand over to Federico Fabbrini to be our third speaker, talking to us from Bolzano.
Thank you very much, Bill, for giving me the floor, and let me thank my fellow panelists and indeed all the contributors to the conference and the book. It is really an honor to share the stage with them, and I would like to contribute by sharing my own screen as well. So I think you should now all be seeing it in front of you. So the topic of my presentation this morning is on Brexit and European integration. And what I would like to do in my next 10-12 minutes is really to reflect on the other side of the channel, if you will. A lot of the focus in the last 1.5 days has been understandably on the UK or EU-UK relationship, but I would like now to shed some light on what Brexit means for the prospects of European integration now that the transition period has finished and the UK has, as Bridget just said, left the EU regulatory space. I shall obviously disclose that my remarks are based on two recent works of mine. One is the monograph Brexit and the Future of the European Union that appeared before Christmas, but already in my final chapter to volume 2 of the book series, the one focused on the withdrawal agreement, I started thinking about what the withdrawal of the UK meant for the future of the European Union. So what I will do next is really divide my presentation in 4 points. Here is the plan de l'exposé. First of all, I will suggest that, in fact, Brexit has not damaged European integration. In fact, to some extent, what we have seen since last January 2020, when the UK formally withdrew from the European Union, is that the EU27 has made a big leap forward, particularly in response to COVID-19. And that is, in my view, a sign of the resilience of the project. But secondly, I will also underline how, in fact, even without the UK, there are strong disintegration pressure at play within the European Union, which are significantly challenging the future of the project of integration. And I will argue, and that's my third point, that many of these pressures and the difficulties in dealing with them have to do with institutional weaknesses in the system of governance of the European Union. And the point of governance that Nicola made as far as the EU-UK relation is concerned, I think to some extent is relevant also for an intra-EU discussion. But with all that said, my last point will be, I try to finish on a more optimistic, but sort of a cautiously optimistic note. That is that I think there are some constitutional opportunities to tackle the difficulties of the European Union, notably in the framework of the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is being approved just today, the joint declaration by the EU institutions. So I go quickly through all these points, and then I very much look forward to exchange during the Q&A session. So let me start by emphasizing the resilience of integration. I think this is a point worth mentioning because some observers after Brexit and the years after the referendum had suggested that that was the beginning of the end for the European Union. What we rather saw is that this is really not the case. On the contrary, despite the decision of Britain to leave the European Union, the EU has advanced. The EU27 have stick together as a union. And I would suggest that the best example of that really occurred right after the withdrawal of the United Kingdom in the spring last year, when the EU put together a strong response to the pandemic. Initially, that was done by using some tested instrument action by the ECB, the Eurogroup, but the game changer certainly arrived in May when the European Commission proposed a new massive recovery fund called Next Generation EU, which was ultimately approved by the European Council in July, and then following negotiation at legislative level between the Council and the European Parliament, it was approved in a package deal of EU legislation, Council regulation, European Parliament and Council regulation on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and then, of course, the new budget and the own resource decision to fund this project. But leaving the technical detail aside, what is crucial to emphasize is that Next Generation EU is potentially an Hamiltonian moment for Europe. It is a major transfer of fiscal powers from the member states to the EU. The European Commission, for the first time, gets the empowerment to issue common debt on behalf of the Union worth 750 billion euros. This common debt will have to be repaid by raising European taxes. There is already an agreement by the institution on that point. Essentially, through Next Generation EU, the European Union gets for the first time a fiscal capacity. And as we know from the history of other federal experiences from Switzerland to the United States, that is usually a turning point in the integration process. And certainly, the implications of this are massive, notably as far as economic and monetary union is concerned. The EU had gone through the euro crisis in the last decade. Next Generation EU is the step that allows EMU deepening by endowing the EU with a fiscal power that matches its monetary power. So all this is good and shows that integration is indeed quite resilient. Yet, I think we would be fooling ourselves if we were seeing only the shiny parts of things, because I am of the view that, in fact, there are still very strong centrifugal pressures at play in the context of the EU 27, which are challenging the process. And if we look around, we actually see plenty of examples of that. I mean, I mentioned a minute ago the strong and positive reaction by the EU to the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring of last year, but certainly if we're looking at how the EU is now managing the vaccination process, production, distribution of vaccine, we are lagging behind compared to other countries, including the United Kingdom, and that is not putting us in a good light. Then secondly, also worth emphasizing that, yes, Next Generation EU is a big step forward, but it was hard fought. There were strong opposition from a group of Nordic countries which resisted till almost the very end the idea of solidarity on those points. Then the Eastern countries came in by opposing rule of law conditionality attached to the new budgetary resources of the Union. They even basically hijacked the approval of the next MFF, the European Multi-Annual Financial Framework 2021-2027, which until December was basically subject to Hungarian and Polish veto, which was ultimately overcome, and I'll come back to this in a second, by a shoddy compromise reached in the European Council before Christmas, which ultimately allowed the Parliament and the Council to approve the regulation just in time before the end of the year. And on top of all this, another strong example of how integration isn't going really wonderfully is the Schengen system. Together with the euro, free movement among continental European states is probably the most visible symbol of European integration. And in the aftermath of COVID, basically the system has been suspended. Nobody speaks about this openly, but we are in a patchwork situation where every state is putting limits at circulation across its border. So what we see, I think, taking a picture of the state of the EU anno 2021, is still lots of ongoing cleavages. I would emphasize particularly the East-West cleavage on issues connected to respect for the rule of law. Orban's expulsion from the European Parliament EPP group just the other day is the strongest example of that. And as much as Next Generation EU has deepened economic and monetary union, I think what we see here is the deepening of other problems, notably the rule of law problem that is a cancer that is getting harder and harder to fight for the EU. Now, why is that the case? Well, I might be biased by my own expertise by being a new lawyer, but I think institutional weaknesses do explain quite a bit of where we are in terms of the state of the European Union. In this slide, I want to focus particularly on two institutions which I think are, I wouldn't say running wild, but certainly not functioning to the best of their ability. One is the European Council and the other is the European Commission. Now, the European Council has become, for all practical purpose, the EU king. That was not meant to be the case under the treaties. That was not meant to be the case by those that drafted first the European Constitution and then the Lisbon Treaty. But de facto, this is what has turned out being the reality on the ground. The European Council regularly gets involved on all issues connected to European policy and operates like a king in a pre-constitutional state. The European Council is executive, the European Council is legislature, the European Council now is also a judge. I mentioned it previously. In December last, the European Council basically already made a ruling on whether the rule of law conditionality regulation attached to the MFF is legal or not, taking over a job from the European Court of Justice. Now, this intergovernmental drift is very problematic because it, I think, deprives the Union of proper checks and balances. And as we know, the European Council is actually not that good at getting the job done. But at the same time, the other institution, which traditionally was seen by many as the counterweight, if you will, in the supranational logic, meaning the European Commission, has also shown some limitation. I put it here, and I hope my Commission friends, some of them joining us this afternoon, won't be offended. I call it a villain here, and I'm obviously thinking of the blunder at the end of January when the Commission for a few hours triggered Article 16 of the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, attached to the withdrawal agreement. But certainly, you would expect the Commission, which is a technocratic body with a lot of expertise, not to make such mistakes. We've spoken extensively about it yesterday, and yet it happened. And I think that creates some confidence issues for the European Union. So the governance of the EU remains uncertain, and I know Bridget might disagree with me, and we might come back to this later on. But there is a limit, I believe, to what muddling through can allow us to go through in this context. Now, let me come to my final point, and this is, as I said, the more optimistic note. I do think actually there are some constitutional opportunities for the European Union to deal with its difficulties, and these are connected most notably to the incoming project to establish a conference on the future of Europe. As you know, this was an idea that Macron launched a while back at the time of before the European Parliament election and before the UK withdrawal from the Union. It eventually has been approved by all institutions, and yesterday and today the Parliament and the Council are going to sign a joint declaration that is launching this initiative. We still have to see whether the conference will actually achieve anything. Certainly the joint declaration is a bit vague, to say the least, but we know from practice that once those initiatives start, they can take a life of their own. And in this regard, I also want to mention a factor. I don't do this only for Bill's pleasure. I know he's a Italianophile, but certainly the appointment by Mario Draghi as Prime Minister of Italy is to some extent a game changer, because he's an insider on EU issues, someone who has gained huge credibility in saving the euros 10 years ago, and his help as Prime Minister of Italy could be important in pushing Europe forward at a time that it's critical. But of course, the outcome remains very uncertain here. So that's why I said I want to bring in some optimism, but it's cautious optimism. We need to see whether that will indeed succeed. So just to wrap up and conclude, I know my time is coming to an end. Integration is alive, certainly after Brexit, but maybe not well. There are some problems here and there, and we keep seeing them. I think, therefore, we need to be quite open to the idea of restarting a debate on constitutional reforms to tackle the institutional weaknesses of the European Union. And I know some institutions are very sensitive and share that view. Just last week, I was speaking at the European Parliament where this argument was well taken, but I am fully aware that, of course, other institutions, notably the Council, are much more skeptical about such prospect. In any case, what I think certainly remains in the background as a big question is, what about the future of the United Kingdom? To a large extent, the potential success of the UK outside the EU, and this is something we will only fully understand in the years to come, well, that might represent a counter model for some European member states. Certainly, the fact that a prominent German newspaper just days ago published a headline saying we are envying the Brits who are now outside the EU and have vaccinated close to half of their population. Well, that it is not a strong sort of woe for the future of Europe, but no doubt much ink will have to be spilled on those topics moving forward, and we are certainly here more in the speculation than in analysis. So I will stop here, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Federico, and thank you for putting even more responsibility on the shoulders of poor Mario Draghi. Of course, I am a very so great admirer of Mr. Draghi, but of course he is not only given the name of Super Mario, a Japanese video game character named after an Italian, but also Cristiano Ronaldo. by one of the Italian politicians. And so what you are suggesting is, like Ronaldo, he must not only win the league for Juventus, he must win the World Cup for Portugal. And save Europe. Okay, well, let's see. Now, we are now moving into questions. I invite members of the audience to indicate their desire to ask questions by raising their hand, by turning on their screen if they wish. And I've got already some hands up, and I would suggest we go straight to Richard Corbett, whose hand is up, and perhaps he could be unmuted and indeed have his screen turned on and ask his question. Richard.
Hello, yes. My question is to Bridget with her very perceptive analysis of the issue of sovereignty for the UK. Now, if you go back to when Britain joined, the fact that Britain would be pooling a proportion of its sovereignty with its neighbouring countries was actually highlighted by the Heath government at the time. And in the 1975 referendum, the No campaign, with Tony Benn on one side and Enoch Powell on the other, very much focused on the issue of sovereignty and some other issues like food prices, but sovereignty was one of their key points. And yet an overwhelming majority at that time was not persuaded by those arguments. What do you think has changed in the meantime to make sovereignty so much more salient this time? Or was it just a clever slogan, take back control? Or was there more to it? Was there an underlying shift in perceptions in Britain?
Excellent question. I'll ask Bridget to answer it straight away. We may collect questions together, but let's go straight away to that. As a Brit, I'm curious as to whether sovereignty is an idea whose time has come, or whether it's an idea that will pass quite quickly.
I think, Richard, that's a great question. So I would say, in response, I would say sovereignty never quite left the UK discourse on EU membership. Secondly, I would say that it was at the minimalist end in terms of supranationalism. Successive British governments used opt-outs in order to protect core state powers. So even at the level of the political elite, sovereignty never went away, albeit a majority were comfortable with the pooling sharing for this period. I would say two things probably in response. I would say, firstly, that there was a constant drip feed of anti-Europeanism emerging from the British tabloid press. I mean, it was relentless. And that, of course, meant that not that you necessarily even had to read it. All you had to do was look at the headlines as you passed along the street and get very negative messages. Secondly, I think that the Conservative Party itself really had a civil war, a continuing civil war from largely from Major on the issue. And of course, UKIP was also the emergence of UKIP, albeit not successful in national elections, but of course, as you know, the European Parliament. So I think there was a shift. And then underlying all of that, there were clearly the socioeconomic shifts within the UK itself. In other words, the very strong class divisions, but also then territorial divisions, the so-called northern, where Brexit really took hold, the contrast between the cities and the shires and the towns. So I think you're absolutely, I mean, so it isn't just at the level, obviously, of ideas. There also were underlying political socioeconomic shifts that contributed. But that said, one shouldn't underestimate, I think, the way in which that take back control, those three simple words, resonated with the population, resonated sufficiently to get the outcome that we've got. But on the 24th of June, one couldn't have predicted the outcome, the actual Brexit outcome we've ended up with. And I think that very thin, hard Brexit is a Johnson Gove Frost construction.
Which would suggest that it is changeable in the future, which is perhaps what, or at least as a result of political debate in the future, which is very, very interesting. Paola Mariani, and then Darren Kelly and Vernon Bogdanov. Paola.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. They were amazing. I have some point because you remember maybe that I wrote with Giorgio the chapter on trade on goods, and so I have some observation on the presentation of Nicolas and Bridget. First, Nicolas, I do agree with you that this system is this decentralized system can have an impact on the application implementation of the treaty. And my impression is, of course, I'm talking about trading goods, just trading goods, but my impression is that this system is going to change due to the intervention of the technical committees. I mean, as you said, there are many provisions saying that you have to negotiate further in order to have the solution. And my impression is that and of course you need then the political approbation by the Partnership Council, but the Partnership Council will work on the proposal from the technicians. And my impression is that some technical solution are so obvious, and there is no a real political, a real sovereign issue in determining some solution. Because, for example, think about the rules of origin and their impact in the supply chain. There are very technical regulation, but at the same time they are so important for the industries and for the organization. And so I think that in the end, if the power is in the hands of the technician, maybe we can have a better system. I don't support this solution because I think that even if I am happy as Federico for Mario Draghi here in Italy, but my idea, my view is that in some way the European system is better because the Commission is under the control of the Parliament, and in the solution of the treaty, you don't have it's really governmental control. And then about the Brigid intervention, I think it's very inspiring because in studying trade on goods and trade in general, the problem of sovereignty is really important. And as you said before, the concept of sovereignty in international law is really difficult to define, because there is a very different way to interpret sovereignty, and the country themselves have different approach. I mentioned an example, Turkey, that I think is one of the most sovereignist, is it correct, this word in English? Because in Italian we're sovranisti, I'm not sure that is, but imposing sovereign and stronger country, they are in a customs union with the European Union. What's the point to be sovereign, to decide if a chicken has to be washed by chlorine or not? What's the point in the current trade relation between states? I mean, I really don't understand. If you want, I understand that it's important for UK to be sovereign in regulation. Okay, but this is costly. You need your government making all the negotiation about so the technical rules of and in the end, maybe it's because I live in a very weird country, but in the end, I'm so happy that it's not one of my ministry deciding these technical rules, because if not, I don't know, the Commission has the technicality. And then, you know, what do you do with this freedom? Because I mean, now in the economic relation between states, you can distinguish between rule maker and rule taker. And you are a rule maker if you are a big market. And there is no, I mean, if you are China, you can, you have some power. But if you are UK is an important country, of course, but it has not the power, the economic power to make rules. I make an example, Switzerland. You know that Switzerland is not part of the European Union, but and the regulation is a web of bilateral agreements. But in the end, for the goods, if Switzerland has to be aligned to the European Union, there is a very interesting research made by a Swiss academic, and they analyzed all the legislation, all the technical legislation about trade on goods. And in the end, the result was that Switzerland is one of the most aligned countries in Europe, more than the EU member states, because they, of course, they don't have the regulation directive, but they have to transpose the regulation in the system. And they made this transposition by the parliament, of course, but the method is...
I must interrupt.
I'm going to finish. They make a sort of cut and paste from the EU legislation. And why? Because it's convenient. If they are aligned, they can trade with the EU. So this is okay.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you very much.
Sorry for...
No, that's absolutely fine. And of course, the sovereign choice of cutting and pasting is really what they're expressing, is what you're saying. So Darren Kelly. No, we can't hear you.
Is that okay now?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you to all the panelists and to the team at the Brexit Institute for organising a really good event. I have a question for Nicola or any of the panelists who might want to come into it. Throughout the negotiation stage of Brexit, Ireland has enjoyed a very strong level of commitment and understanding from the Commission, and particularly Michel Barnier's team, of the sensitivities around the Northern Irish border. Now we are transitioning from that negotiation stage to ongoing governance. How can we ensure that that understanding and that focus on Northern Ireland is kept up in the long term? Is there an argument, for example, for permanent representation for Ireland on the Joint Partnership Council or on DG Trade, or these bodies for the most active in governing the EU-UK relationship?
Thank you, Darren. And that actually relates very much to a question that was sent in advance by, actually, I don't know the name, but a former senior civil servant of the Northern Ireland Assembly, asking about how Northern Ireland's voice could be made in both in the making of future EU policy that will be implemented in Northern Ireland. Does the EU recognize this question about the lack of voice, or does it regard it as an issue for the UK to deal with? And related to it, the same person asks, what role do you see for subnational engagement in the new UK-EU partnership, Northern Ireland not only, but also Scotland, Wales, given that the UK government has not yet committed to a role for devolved nations in the UK delegation of the Partnership Council? Would either Bridget or Nicola or Federico like to answer that briskly? And then Nicola, and then Federico.
Thank you. I'll be happy to answer. Just a word on what Paola has mentioned about Switzerland, and it also goes with what Bridget had discussed. I mean, Switzerland doesn't care about sovereignty. Swiss are pragmatic people. So if they can make money out of any sort of arrangement, naturally, the voters, they want us to be sovereign. So we tell them we're sovereign. And then, as you say, we autonomously decide to copy Europe, and it works. But then I disagree on the capacity to negotiate. Again, as I said, and this will link us to the question of Darren, the member states, when they authorize ratification, they say, and we will be there at every meeting. So this is why it will be difficult. You know how trade negotiations are, even rules of origin. There are specific national interests for this business, this industry, this, and so it will be extremely difficult because the member states are there. And it's not the same thing like the Commission when she legislates internally. It has a monopoly to propose. Here we have two sides, and on one side, the Commission has no maneuver space because the member states will be there and say, but I have this industry and I want this industry to be protected, so I want an exception. Then UK on its side say, well, if we don't have that, so it will be extremely difficult. I regret, but that's the truth of such negotiation. As regard Darren Kelly, I think his question was about Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. Then the answer is yes, they will be there all the time. And certainly they will make sure that the interests of Ireland, which are aligned or not with Northern Ireland, will be represented. Now, whether the other member state at some point will become upset or not, that's another issue. But basically, they will be there all the time. Northern Ireland, it's much more complex. And as you know, the issue of representation within the EU polity of subnational entities is not solely an issue for the UK. So naturally, if you make arrangement for Northern Ireland, I can see my Catalans and Basque friends saying, oh yeah, that we like it, why don't we have it? So you will have some countries saying, no way, that's a red line to give anything to Northern Ireland, even though it's a different situation because they're not really in, but the law applies and so on. We, and also countries from the EEA, make a subtle distinction between decision-making and decision-shaping. So meaning that somehow, even though you cannot participate to decision-making, you can participate to the discussion leading to decision-making. So your voice is being heard, but you do not decide. So maybe something there should be imagined for Northern Ireland to be somehow consulted. Actually, maybe if there was some sort of informal arrangement with the Commission, and it could be in the Commission interest, then the voice of Northern Ireland would be much stronger, because it would be through the Commission than through any member state. So, but that's a very sensitive issue.
Federico, briefly, and then we'll come on to Werner Bogdanov.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, very quickly on a couple of points. The first one is on Ireland's ability to influence the Commission. In my slide, I offensively called the Commission a villain in its managing of the Article 16 protocol crisis at the end of January. And I think that speaks to the point that Darren was referring to. I think certainly the channel of communication broke, and an institution that should know best did not consult with Ireland on how to manage this. So indeed, things have changed from time of the negotiation to now, the management of the relationship, although Nicola is right that the TCA will see Ireland there all the time to decide. On Northern Ireland, there was a written question we received. Well, there is this joint consultative working group established by the withdrawal agreement, which should serve as a forum to bring in the concerns of Northern Ireland civil society and business. But I think Dagmar was explaining yesterday that it hasn't really worked. Then I got a written question from Richard Corbett on the European Council. I think he had a point where he said the European Council is like a president in a semi-presidential system. I myself made that argument beforehand. But what we witnessed in the last few months is, I think, something even more than that. The European Council has gone beyond the intergovernmental borders we knew, really taking almost roles that are judicial and that should belong to the European Court of Justice. That's really what happened with the rule of law regulation, I think. And if I can just add a point to Richard and Bridget exchange on sovereignty and the 1975 referendum, I think it's very interesting. We remember what the ballot question was, because at that time the Brits were asked if they wanted to join the common market. That was the explicit wording of the ballot box. So I guess the argument of the Brexiteer is that the UK was convinced into joining something which then became something different. My own argument is we never were a common market. It was always a political union since day one, particularly for the countries of continental Europe. But I suppose that question about the finality of the project of European integration does explain the sovereignty schizophrenia of Britain on its relationship with the EU. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Federico. Vernon Bogdanor. Very nice.
I just want to make a couple of brief comments on what Bridget said and what Federico said. But we weren't asked in 1975 whether we wanted to join. We were asked whether we wanted to stay in. And that is important, I think, because Britain was a very frightened country in 1975, with inflation at 26%, unemployment growing, the trade unions seeming to have a stranglehold on the country. And Christopher Soames, our first EU commissioner, said, this is no time to leave a Christmas club, let alone the common market. The element of fear was there. That wasn't there in 2016. Britain was a more confident country after Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, very different sort of country. But as Bridget implied, it was never a decision, a conscious decision at any rate, to merge sovereignty. That was never desired. And he, I think, contrary to what Richard said, he did slightly make it ambiguous. So no surrender of essential sovereignty, which, I mean, begs a number of questions. The second factor there in 1975 was much greater deference to political leaders. If Ted Heath, Margaret Thatcher, Harold Wilson, Jeremy Thorpe, and all the rest said we should stay, then people said, well, we ought to stay. And the people who were opposed to it were a motley lot: Enoch Powell, Tony Benn, the IRA, the National Front, and so on. Now, that deference and trust had gone by 2016. There was much less belief that simply because your political leaders told you to do something, you should necessarily do it. And finally, of course, the big element was migration, which made concrete people's worries about sovereignty. And it's very interesting now that we're out of the EU, opinion polls show that there's a very liberal attitude to migration. People wanted it managed, they didn't want it stopped. And as I say, the survey evidence shows we have a very liberal attitude to migration. Can I come on to what Federico said? I think the deepening of monetary union in the EU, contrary to what he believes, is very dangerous for the EU, because if you take away monetary policy, fiscal policy from national states, what is there to argue about in general elections in the states? And the premise of monetary union, I mean, it starts with Jean Monnet, it goes on through Schuman and Delors, is that you can gradually take powers away from national states, almost without people noticing, until at some time there'll be more allegiance to the European Union than to national states. It'll be a quasi-federal body, as of course Australia is, Canada, Germany, and that isn't happening. And all sorts of devices trying to ensure that, like direct election, co-decision, a Spitzencandidate, all the rest of it, and they haven't worked effectively. The democratic deficit is still there, and the more powers you transfer, the more you increase it. And I think it's time to ask whether the Monnet, Schuman, Delors conception of Europe is the right one for the EU. Now, as Bridget implied in what she said, you may argue Britain's a different sort of country from the other member states and should never have joined in the first place. But you might also say that Britain was actually in the vanguard in Europe, because thanks to her long evolutionary history, she appreciated more than many other member states what the sacrifice of sovereignty actually means in practice. Other countries are very happy to accept it rhetorically, particularly if they were coming out of dictatorships. But when it comes to actual decisions, they're less prepared to do that. For example, Greece on budgetary questions, the Hanseatic League on sharing debts, Poland and Hungary on the rule of law, and all sorts of other issues. It's very easy to say you're prepared to share sovereignty. What happens when it really attacks fundamental national interests? And surely the whole lesson of the euro crisis and migration is that when the EU entrenches on those fundamental national interests, it will arouse popular parties and an undermining of the whole European ideal. So perhaps the whole ideal needs to be rethought. And sadly, Britain having left, we ought to be in the vanguard of that, but we're not. And Bridget is right in a way that sovereignty means the only logic is a hard Brexit, because the only point, no point in leaving the EU and having exactly the same rules. That means regulation without representation, which is in effect the position of Northern Ireland in the regulatory area. So it's a paradox that we're leaving just when it's arguable the British or the Gaullist conception of Europe, if you like, is the one that Europe actually needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Vernon. And I'm going to, with just 4 minutes to go before the end of the panel, I'm going to ask each of the panelists in order to give closing thoughts, responding to the questions that have been raised, including Vernon's points just now. Perhaps start with Nicola, because also Switzerland has been called into question a number of times. And this issue of migration that Vernon raises is actually the one, I think, very populist issue on European engagement that does cause real political issues and indeed legislative issues in Switzerland. So let me ask every one of you to give us about a minute or so of final thoughts.
Okay, thank you. So in a minute, it'll be hard to say much, but I would say first, this sovereignty issue is central. And yes, it plays an important role in Switzerland, but we make this distinction between formal sovereignty, and we have kept it, and de facto, we accept that we are totally aligned. So there is a schizophrenia, and it works. So basically, as you said, Bill, make Brexit boring. This is exactly what Switzerland makes with its relationship with the EU. We have 120 bilateral agreements, 120 sectoral committees, and all sort of technical discussion. But then when the big issues come to the voters, we're in trouble. But as long as we remain technical, that's fine. So sovereignty is a central issue. And I would just like to remind you, and I'm sorry I cannot answer all the detail, but there is this fantastic 1923 ruling from the Permanent Court of International Justice about Wimbledon ship. And the issue was sovereignty. And the court say the essence of sovereignty is a capacity to enter into agreements and to lessen your sovereignty. That's the secret of sovereignty. And that's very delicate to convey to voters. So I will stop there, even though there are many other things to say, but thank you for the very interesting panel.
Marvelous, Nicola. Bridget.
So let me begin with the area of regulation and regulatory autonomy. And David Frost had a very interest in his Brussels speech, talked about making our own laws for our own circumstances. That's not what regulation is about in the 21st century. Regulation in the 21st century is about an ability to shape the regulations that govern the modern capitalist economy. And there are three regulatory superpowers in the world: China, US, EU. Basta. So you can have all the formal regulatory autonomy you like, but you're going to end up, if you want to trade, and both in services and in goods, you're going to end up with regulations predominantly shaped by others if you're on the outside and you don't have a seat at the table. Secondly, just to respond to Vernon, so I think you're completely misreading what's happening in terms of budgetary politics in the EU and in terms of what you call fiscal policy in the EU. There is no way that the EU will take over the predominant taxing capacity of its member states. Not going to happen, will not happen. What it will do is have marginal capacity to tax for common goods that are European, and they will be very marginal. Also, there is a virtuous cycle in the common debt issuance now, because it will create a European capital market. It already has been oversubscribed and will in fact help also the provision of capital to European industry and business. So the idea that somehow or other we're entering into a classical federal system with very strong public funding, public finance capacity, we're nowhere close. So I think that we really need to distinguish between add-ons. There is a centralization of monetary policy, but certainly not fiscal policy. That would neither, in my view, be desirable or feasible. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And the UK can end up with the hard Brexit it's ended up with. But this will cost people their jobs. It will cost people their opportunity to travel, to work, to go elsewhere. So if the society is happy with the cost, I've no problem with it. It is the choice of the British people to do this. But look at the impact on territorial politics in the UK. Look at the impact on the union. Is it something worth bargaining for? Well, I'm not a UK citizen, so I don't have agency. But the cost is very high, in my view, to the United Kingdom. There were other ways of protecting. In fact, as an opt-out country in the EU, probably from a UK perspective, the UK had the best of all worlds.
Thank you, Bridget. As there's quite a bit to that. That's right, absolutely. In our opt-outs and so forth. Now, Federico Fabbrini, I'm going to give you the last word, and also, since we are just slipping over time, I'm going to ask you to close the session as well, because I know that you have indeed points to make for the next panel as well. So, thank you personally to the panel for an excellent discussion. Thank you to Federico for closing the panel and for inviting me today. Over to you, Federico.
Thank you so much, Bill, for concluding this and handing me back the floor. I don't feel I can now really add more. I echo what Bridget said in terms of her last answer to Vernon. But if the other panelists agree, what I will simply do is essentially sort of carry over, as in a virtual Brexit transition, the conversation we just had in this panel, moving on to the high-level debate. I see that both Tom Haney, Ambassador Tom Haney, and Ivan Rogers, Sir Ivan Rogers, are with us. And since the program does not foresee a break, I think it might just make sense to move straight into that. Hello, Ivan, I see you there. I think everyone can see you too.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear, and I see also Tom Haney. Hello, Tom.
Hi, greetings from Brussels. I hope you can see and hear me.
We can see you and hear you. Okay, so I think we are then ready to go, and let me start by saying, ladies and gentlemen, I am truly honored and delighted to chair this final high-level debate that concludes our book conference on the framework of new EU-UK relations. And it is a great pleasure to introduce and welcome virtually at the Brexit Institute of Dublin City University, Ambassador Tom Haney and Sir Ivan Rogers, who are two leading observers and indeed players in the Brexit debate. Both speakers are incredibly well known and I think constitute some of the finest example of the diplomatic corps of Ireland and the United Kingdom. Let me just very briefly say something about them. Tom is currently the permanent representative of Ireland to the European Union. He's a graduate of another Dublin university I cannot mention for obvious reasons of competitions. Jokes aside, he's a graduate of UCD. He's a diplomat with an extensive career and experience, having represented Ireland at the International Organization in Vienna as the liaison office in Brussels for NATO, and in Geneva for the United Nations. But I also want to mention that Tom was among the many roles he had, also the joint secretary of the North-South Ministerial Council, which is a body established by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Ivan, instead, is a graduate from Oxford and École Normale Supérieure, and he was the former permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the European Union from 2013 to 2017. He previously was Europe advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron. Of course, he later became a strong critic of how Prime Minister Theresa May managed the negotiating strategy, and many of you will know him for his resignation in that context as well. So our two speakers this morning are close insiders of London, Dublin, and the Brussels negotiating table, and we're really fortunate to have them with us this morning. And I think this is very much fitting with the ethos of the Brexit Institute, which as Ireland only and Europe first center specifically created to analyze Brexit both from a research and a policy perspective, is eager to bring together academics and institutional players. And indeed, after 2 days of intensive academic exchange that, as you know, will result in the publication of volume 3 of the book series entitled The Law and Politics of Brexit, which I'm running at Oxford University Press. Well, after 2 days of academic talks, I think we now have the opportunity for a high-level institutional engagement, and clearly the timing couldn't be more ideal in light of the latest development, the UK unilateral decision to suspend part of the application of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the retaliation in Brussels by the European Parliament that has decided to put on hold approval and ratification of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So without further ado, I suggest we immediately get into the presentation by Tom and Ivan. If the two speakers agree, I think Tom should probably go first, and rules of engagement, 10 minutes each, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Federico, and thank you for inviting me along to this session. It's an honor to share a platform with Sir Ivan. I think, in fact, our paths overlapped in Brussels some years ago, but I was in Coreper 1 and Sir Ivan was in Coreper 2, and at times they are very different galaxies. And of course, now, since Sir Ivan is now a very distinguished commentator on the issues we're discussing, whereas I have the privilege of still living the dream here in Brussels in Coreper 2, and Sir Ivan is commenting on the dream, but sometimes it seems like a nightmare. Even although, I mean, I dipped in and out this morning of the discussions, and I perhaps have some random thoughts picking up on some of the points that were made this morning. First of all, in relation to the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement, on the trade and cooperation agreement and all its works and pomps, we're still awaiting ratification. The EU has, of course, asked for the extension of the ratification date to the end of April, and we're awaiting the consent now of the European Parliament. And in this period, the UK has asked that there be no meetings of the various bodies under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So all of that area is still, to some extent, untested. And there was quite a lot of talk this morning about the future relationship. And of course, ultimately, the future relationship between the UK and the European Union will depend on the political willingness of both sides to enter into a close and cooperative relationship. All of these agreements won't work unless we actually want them to work, and we are committed to them. And to be honest, I think from the discussions here in Brussels, people are still trying to work out the level and the degree of commitment in London to the future relationship. There have been political statements from London saying they want the best possible relationship with the close neighbours, but at times some of the statements and some of the behavior cast doubt on the level of commitment. Recently here in Brussels, there have been meetings of the Foreign Affairs Council and the General Affairs Council. And in both of those councils, the issue of the future relationship between the EU and the UK was discussed by ministers. And in both discussions, it was clear from the EU side that there is a desire for a close, ambitious, warm relationship, and a recognition that a neighbour on our doorstep that's chairing the G7 at the moment, that's going to host the Glasgow Conference of Parties on Climate Change, that's a member of the Security Council, and so on. We absolutely have to have as close a possible relationship. But on the other hand, firstly, as was said earlier, in the area of common foreign and security policy, the UK declined the offer of putting the relationship on a formal legal footing. And there, I think there is some concern that the UK's preference might be for bilateralization of the relationships and a focus, first of all, on developing closer bilateral relations with some of the larger capitals. And then secondly, having ad hoc relationships with constellations of member states, depending on the issue at stake. And that the UK preference might be to go down that road rather than developing a broader relationship with the European Union as such in Brussels. And secondly, in the economic, trade, security area, again, there is a desire on the EU side, I think, for a close cooperation. But then you hear these voices in London talking about changing the regulatory regime to unleash financial services in London, to make the best of Brexit. You hear talk of using new genetic technologies in agriculture now that the UK is freed from the EU's regulatory regime. You hear talk of using state subsidies for levelling up and for supporting frontier technologies and so on. So a lot of the statements coming from London suggest that the UK would want to be in a more competitive relationship with the European Union than a cooperative one. And again, that gives cause for concern and also results in a very strong focus by the EU side on the whole issue of level playing field, dynamic alignment, and so on. So I think we're probably, I mean, we're in the early phases of the departure of the UK, and we're still in Brussels waiting to see what direction the global Britain will go in. And I think that the imminent publication of this UK paper on the future of foreign security and defence policy, this integrated paper, will be of interest. Secondly, I think, and I don't know whether it's fully appreciated in London, that the later stages of the negotiations on the TCA were very much overshadowed on the EU side by the arrival of the pandemic and intense discussions in Brussels on how to deal with this in an area where you had free movement of goods, people, services, and so on. And the pandemic is having and going to have quite profound effects on the way the European Union operates in the future. And one of the effects, one from an Irish point of view that's not so attractive, is now a very strong emphasis internally in the European Union on this new concept of strategic autonomy. Nobody quite knows what this means. It seems to have meanings ranging from resilience along a spectrum to protectionism. And it's resulted in a European Union which is increasingly inward-looking and more focused on developing its own internal systems to be a global player, to be able to protect itself in a world where globalization is now in doubt, to developing a new sort of more equal relationship with the United States, to look to its relationship with China in a different way to the way in which the United States is looking, and so on. And in all of this discussion on strategic autonomy and the role of the European Union, you don't really hear much talk of the role of the United Kingdom. And in fact, in the internal discussions in the EU, it is to some extent striking the degree to which the departure of the UK has almost now been forgotten, if that's not too strong a word. I think towards the closing phases of the negotiation last year, there was definitely a strong sense of exhaustion around the table with all issues to do with the United Kingdom. And the fact that some of those issues are now still there is almost an irritant. There's a strong desire to move on, to look at bigger issues, to deal with the big economic challenges in the post-COVID world, to look at the EU's strategic relationships with other big powers around the world. And of course, we want, there is a desire to have a good relationship with the UK, but it's definitely not up there among the top few issues that are under discussion in Brussels. And finally, just to mention, in the negotiations of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, I think one issue, there are two points worth stressing. First of all, the European Union remained united in all of this throughout the negotiations of the Withdrawal Agreement and of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and it remained united almost to the surprise of itself. And despite efforts by the United Kingdom to divide the EU throughout the negotiations, the EU managed to remain united. And this has left a sort of a positive taste in the EU. And the EU seems determined to remain united on this. And also it's given the EU an appetite to become more united on other issues. And secondly, the approach of the UK throughout the Trade and Cooperation Agreement negotiations was quite confrontational, quite aggressive. The word sovereignty was mentioned